A film should be like a dream you have during a night, which you don't fully understand, but which brings a vision, a portent, which holds a message. This quote from Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky describes Mirror, his semi-autobiographical film that revolves around the memories and reflections of the protagonist Alexei. Alexei is a poet, just like Tarkovsky's father, and he's also a semi-portrait of Tarkovsky himself. This film is shot from his perspective as we watch his mind reflect on his life. What's interesting about Mirror is how it deals with time. Unlike conventional films with straightforward chronological plots, Mirror unfolds more like a fluid visual poem of interconnected memories, dreams, and segments of current reality. Its temporality mimics that of the human consciousness. The narrative is fragmented into episodes. Some episodes are of different stages of Alexei's life: his childhood, which is spent with his mother as his father is absent in war, and then his relationship with his wife and his son, and then his death. Intertwined with these shots of his life are incoherent clips, such as newsreel footage of World War II, or dreams of his mother levitating, or long shots of wind. Throughout the film, the color grading slips between color, black and white, and sepia, almost at random. Sometimes the clips are accompanied by a voiceover of the filmmaker's father, Arseny Tarkovsky, reading his own poetry.
А в хрустале пульсировали реки, дымились горы, брезжили моря. И ты держала сферу на ладони хрустальную, и ты спала на троне, и, Боже правый, ты была моя.
The film seems intentionally confusing. The characters are not explicitly named, and Alexei's mother and wife are played by the same actress. Some characters are shown once and never again, and we don't know how they're relevant to the story. We don't even know if there is a story. Sometimes the name is said, sometimes a date is given, and we work on that information to piece together some continuity to the story. But even though the clips all seem disjointed and erratically placed, there is a harmony in how they all fit together. Elements are simultaneously conflicting and converging. This harmony is organic and natural, yet is also controlled and highly methodical. During the 1970s, when Mirror was released in the Soviet Union, there was an official government-sanctioned art form called Soviet realism. Soviet realism is a propagandistic art style that's meant to portray a positive vision of Soviet life. It promotes patriotism by glorifying Soviet achievements. It rejected Western abstract art styles because they're deemed elitist, because they're inaccessible to the working class, which is the backbone of Soviet society. Soviet realism emphasized the accessibility and objective clarity of art, and Mirror seems to be the exact opposite of that, which is why the film was censored and its release delayed. Rather than presenting a positive, collective Soviet identity, or even an objective reality of anything, it's subjective and highly solipsistic, in that it rejects external reality entirely in favor of the filmmaker's own subjective truth. The view that this film is esoteric and elitist is somewhat misguided, because it's not just inaccessible to the working class, it's not accessible to anyone, which makes it non-elitist because everyone is equally confused. Tarkovsky does explore quite heavily the Russian historical identity, but he does so through his own personal subjective lens, through the impact that it made on his life. World War II, for example, plays in the backdrop of his consciousness. It's in the absence of his enlisted father, and in the war footage that interrupts his memories. The most common form of written storytelling encountered in our everyday lives is prose, like in novels where there's a chronological progression from one sentence to the next, and the plot unfolds in a clear linear order of start, middle, and end. Conventional films with linear plots are akin to prose in their structure. We expect that the sequence of shots proceed in chronological order, and that as we progress from shot to shot, the story is also moving forward in time. If conventional films can be said to be the cinematic equivalent, then what would be the cinematic equivalent of poetry, which does not follow a chronological narrative structure, but is rather a series of imagery? It would be something like Mirror, a disjointed collage of images that conveys a feeling rather than a storyline. The abrupt cuts between different episodes in the film are analogous to line breaks in poetry. The pace of this visual poem is punctuated by the time that we spend lingering on these images. Some shots are long and still, and some are fleeting. This is the concept of poetic cinema. Tarkovsky said, "The film has no logic in the usual sense of the word. Its logic is the logic of a dream." Poetic logic is an inherently temporal concept because it concerns the disruption of linear time. The episodic nature of this poetic film fragments linear temporality. Time and again, dreams and memories of the narrator's childhood haunt his subconscious and abruptly deviate him from the present. In one of his dreams about his childhood home, Alexei says,
«Я уже во сне знаю, что мне это только снится. И непосильная радость омрачается ожиданием пробуждения. Я жду и не могу дождаться этого сна, в котором я опять увижу себя ребенком и снова почувствую себя счастливым от того, что еще все впереди, еще все возможно.
The source of his happiness here is the unwritten future and the infinite possibilities that it holds. However, in his dreams, when he tries to enter his childhood home, something prevents him from doing that.
И каждый раз, когда я хочу войти в него, мне всегда что-то мешает.
It's a feeling of restriction. Even if dreaming gives him the ability to go back in time, the limitation here is spatial. He's unable to physically enter the space of his room. This spatial distance between the dreamer and the dream is emphasized by the desynchronized soundscape of the film, which distances the viewer from the image on screen. Most of the film is filled with an unnatural silence. And when there is diegetic sound, which is sound that's supposed to originate from the world of the film and that the characters can hear, it's sonically dissonant in that the richness of the sound mismatches the image. Like when the footsteps of the soldiers crossing the river in the documentary footage are dubbed by just one set of footsteps. When the hayloft burns, only two solitary sound sources are audible, the fire crackling and the bucket swinging. The footsteps of the actors are barely audible. Not only is the sonic richness off, the sonic distance here is also mismatched with the image. For example, this bucket swing is unusually loud for its distance from the camera. And when people speak, even when it's a whisper, their voices are so loud with virtually no background noise.
Может, даже постигают деревья, орешник вот этот.
Это ольха.
Да это не важно.
It sounds like the mic was placed very close to the actor here, but the camera is not. It all sounds like an eerily isolated attempt at recovering diegetic sound. The soundscape imitates the mind of someone who's trying and failing to recover all the details of a distant memory. The pain that Alexei feels towards the loss of his childhood is echoed in Tarkovsky's father's poem First Meetings, which was read earlier in the film.
Сама ложилась мята нам под ноги, и птицам с нами было...
After a lengthy segment of tender and serene imagery, this violent verse abruptly concludes the poem.
Когда судьба по следу шла за нами, как сумасшедший с бритвою в руке.
Likening the ruthless passage of time to the razor of a madman that forces the pair of lovers to leave the lilac and the mint grass behind them. The madman's razor is the dreadful awakening from dreams, it's mortality, and it's the literal conclusion of this film. After Tarkovsky's attempt at creating this beautiful image, one is still forced to awaken when the film itself concludes, and the lush landscape abruptly succumbs to total darkness on the screen. Alexei's desire to return to his childhood motivates the temporal resistance that characterizes this film. Dreaming allows Alexei to escape from the madman's razor. The fear of waking from a beautiful dream mirrors the fear of mortality. In response to this fear, Arseny Tarkovsky's poem Life, Life is read over the Soviet documentary footage in the film.
На свете смерти нет, бессмертны все, бессмертно все. Не надо бояться смерти ни в 17 лет, ни в 70. Ни тьмы, ни смерти нет на этом свете. Мы все уже на берегу морском, и я из тех, кто выбирает сети, когда идет бессмертие косяком. Грядущее свершается сейчас, и если я приподнимаю руку, все 5 лучей останутся у вас.
In this poem, like in the film, temporal resistance takes the form of spatial imagery, hauling in a net to catch immortality, and raising a hand to preserve the now against the onset of the future. This poem is read over the footage of the Soviet soldiers, all of whom most likely died in the war. It's almost as if it's rejecting their mortality. What his father did with poetry here, Tarkovsky tries to do with film. The future is overlapped with the present, just like the time in Mirror, which Tarkovsky describes as being multidimensional, open, and simultaneous. Past, present, and future exist together. It's something like a 4th dimension. Dreams is one way in which Tarkovsky converges multiple timelines. Alexei's reluctance to awaken from the dream of his childhood manifests in the blurring of the line between dream and reality in this film. We usually use awakenings to distinguish between dream and reality, but the certainty of this boundary is annulled early on in the film. Young Alexei first awakens following some scenes from his childhood. We might assume that what precedes this awakening is the child's dream, and what follows the awakening is reality. Yet after a black and white sequence of wind blowing through the trees, the child wakes up again, this time in black and white.
Papa.
This second awakening subverts the ontological certainty provided by the previous awakening. We're now unsure as to whether or not the sequence before the first awakening is a dream, or if the first awakening is contained in the dream that the second awakening wakes up from. Then the film cuts to a dreamlike sequence of his mother washing her hair as the ceiling burns down, and then the mother sees her aged self in a reflection. Then the shrill ringing of the telephone seems to abruptly awaken the narrator from his dream again, and adult Alexei tells his mother on the phone that he woke up from a dream of her. He recounts the events that happened before this point in the film, including his father leaving and the hayloft fire, as if everything that happened was just another dream of his childhood. He asks about the year in which these events took place, which finally gives us temporal context for the sequences of his childhood that preceded this point in the film.
Ну, помнишь, когда сеновал сгорел на хуторе?
Все тогда же, в 35-м. Ладно, ты мне голову заморочил. Я, собственно, вот что. Ты знаешь, Лиза умерла.
Alexei's attempt to get his mother to join him in recalling his childhood is interrupted by a reminder of mortality, as her mother brings up that her friend Lisa died, before the film jumps into a sequence of Lisa and his mother at the printing house when he was younger. The mention of Lisa's death is like the madman's razor. Once again, the memories of his childhood are terminated violently by the reminder of the time that has passed. The film's titular motif of mirrors represents the struggle to distinguish dream from reality, as mirrors blur the boundary between image and the actual world. In mirrors, image and reality collide and become indistinguishable from one another. We realize that in this highly solipsistic sequence, there's no ontological certainty to be grasped. There's no solid ground to stand on, and we just have to surrender to the flow of the film's consciousness. The fragmented episodes in the film are patched together by motifs, which are recurring thematic elements such as mirrors, or a pair of praying hands, or fire. These motifs echo each other across different episodes to create poetic links. For example, let's consider this clip of a bird landing on this child during the war. Later, the same bird appears dead and is revived in the narrator's hand on his deathbed. Despite the lack of temporal or spatial connection between these two moments, the bird functions as a bridge, overlapping the two scenes and allowing the narrator's consciousness to associate the two clips with each other, transcending space and time. Its significance is equivalent to a motif repeated in different lines of a poem. Existing in two distinct spatio-temporal contexts enriches the significance of the bird and its revival. It juxtaposes two pivotal moments, the seizing of the bird, symbolic of seizing control, and its release into flight, symbolic of letting go. While the initial scene is relatively grounded in naturalism despite being very clearly orchestrated, the subsequent evangelical revival adds to it an element of spirituality. This invites the interpretation of the bird as a symbol of a divine awakening, of rebirth and immortality. The linking of motifs here creates a second layer of temporal subversion. We already know that by placing seemingly unrelated episodes next to each other, Tarkovsky fragments temporality in this film. He relies on the audience to create psychological rather than chronological associations between adjacent episodes. Yet the film itself still operates on the expectation that the audience watches the movie chronologically from beginning to end. Just like how even if the images in a poem are arranged non-chronologically, the reader still reads the lines of the poem from top to bottom. The motifs appearing in different episodes allows Tarkovsky to further disrupt the order of his own rearrangement of these events. It gives the episodes the power to associate with non-adjacent episodes, which defies the chronology of the film itself. It adds fluidity to the fragmented temporality of the film. Anchored by these motifs, episodes are layered onto one another, creating a temporal multiplicity. The concept of multiplicity in this film is embodied by the actress Margarita Terrakova, who plays both Alexei's wife Natalia and his mother. Besides the obvious Oedipal undertones of this casting choice, assigning two different generational identities onto the same face converges two disjointed time periods, Alexei's childhood and his adulthood. Natalia is introduced for the first time after so many scenes of seeing Margarita as Alexei's mother. She looks in the mirror as Alexei says, "I always thought you looked like my mother."
Даже когда я просто вспоминаю и детство, и мать, то у матери почему-то...
Natalia comments again on the resemblance between her and Alexei's mother in a photograph. The painting shown here is Da Vinci's portrait of Ginevra de' Benci, a painting that captivated Tarkovsky because of how it affects us simultaneously in two different ways. Tarkovsky writes, "There is something inexpressibly beautiful about her and at the same time repulsive. In Mirror, we need the portrait to introduce a timeless element into the moments that are succeeding each other before our eyes, and at the same time to juxtapose the portrait with the heroine, who emphasize in her and in the actress Margarita Tarakova the same capacity at once to enchant and to repel." The multiplicity expressed through Margarita introduces a timelessness because her face is an element that remains the same despite the succession of time. Alexei's young mother meets the aged version of herself in this sequence. The aged mother is played by Tarkovsky's actual mother in real life. The film's concluding scenes introduce the aged Maria into the setting of Alexei's childhood. She's sitting in a posture that's reminiscent of young Maria at the start of the film. This visual layering creates a parallel temporality between the aged Maria from Alexei's present and her younger self from Alexei's childhood. When the mother's aged self appears in Alexei's childhood memory, it signifies an ending of this cycle of time where Alexei keeps going back to his childhood. The camera finally enters the childhood room, the room that he couldn't enter before it cuts to the scene of him on his deathbed. Death typically indicates temporal closure, and initially it seems this way. He's finally moving forward in time. When Alexei grabs the dead bird and lets it go, it symbolizes him letting go of his childhood. Yet when the bird revives and takes flight, he rejects the terminal temporality of death. His death becomes the start of a rebirth. Literally, because the subsequent scene is a prenatal one. It's a conversation between his parents before he was born, talking about whether they want a boy or a girl. As the young mother turns, what follows is a series of shots of the aged mother inserted into a scene of Alexei's childhood, walking with young Alexei and his young brother. In this final sequence, as he stopped resisting the aging of his mother, he stopped resisting the flow of time. By placing his currently aged mother into his childhood, he merged his past with the present, and thus immortalizes her. While we have been seeing either memories or dreams of events that happened in the past, at the end of the film he prophesizes the future, what happens after his death. The sequence here, like the sequence of his mother floating, is more of a prophecy and a metaphysical epiphany than a memory. By immortalizing his mother, Tarkovsky celebrates his childhood as eternal.
Мам, там керосинка коптит.
Что?
The film abruptly oscillates between Alexei's consciousness and archival footage of historical events that took place during his life. Historical reality, being raw, objective, and overwhelming, interrupts Alexei's poetic and subjective personal reality. History's interruption of his stream of consciousness represents the way that grand historical narratives intrude upon the lives of individuals, how objective reality impresses upon and shapes subjective realities. In this scene of marching soldiers, there's only one pair of footsteps to be heard. It highlights the resistance of a solitary voice against the dominant collective silence. Besides Tarkovsky, you know who else explores their subjective view of the world? The news media. The news media has become heavily polarized. Many biased news sources distort information to further their own political agendas. Being unaware of their biases makes you more susceptible to them, and that's why I've started using Ground News. Ground News is an app and a website that allows you to compare how different news outlets cover the same story. For every news story, it provides you with context about the source of the information, their bias, reliability, and ownership. Let's take a look at this story. It's been covered by over 90 sources. On the bias distribution chart, we can visually see that most of the sources are reporting from the right. Most importantly, we can compare headlines to see how the media spins the story. Comparing these two headlines, it's interesting to see how omitting the subject of children and changing the phrase gender treatments to chemical castration changes the tone of the story. I've been using Ground News to read up on the issues around the world. I think what they're doing is really important because access to factual information is the cornerstone of democracy. So take control of your news consumption by subscribing through my link groundnews/trolleybolly to get 40% off the Vantage subscription, which is what I use to get unlimited access to all the features, or get started with a pro plan for less than $1 a month. I think Ground News is doing important work, and I hope you'll check them out.
И рыбы подымались по реке, и небо развернулось пред глазами, когда судьба по следу шла за нами, как сумасшедший с бритвою в руке.
The dichotomy of image and sound in this film brings about the dichotomy of the mother and the father, as the former is physically absent and only heard through his poetry voiceover, and the latter is visually ever present but silent. The film sees through the perspective of the man. The protagonist Alexei, his son Ignat, the filmmaker, and the voice of his father combine into one male gaze. As Alexei eventually becomes his father by marrying someone who resembles his mother and leaving his family behind like his father did, the men in the film share one voice. The generational identities of Alexei, his son, and his father all overlap. The timelines of their lives repeat across generations, and thus temporality becomes cyclical for both men and the women in the film. Prophecy is made possible by cyclical temporality. Because the characters' generational lives are intertwined, the characters can experience things that they've never experienced before. This explains Ignat's moment of déjà vu.
Что? Током что-то бьет.
Каким током?
Как будто это уже было всего один раз. Тоже деньги собирал.
Что?
А и вообще тут первый раз.
Давай сюда деньги. Перестань фантазировать, я тебя очень прошу.
The male is an objective, godlike voice. He's lyrical and incarnate in poetry. Tarkovsky says that the film is a story of his thoughts, his memories and dreams. He is absent from view, but what he thinks, how he thinks, and what he thinks about builds up a graphic and clearly defined picture of him. The male force in the film is beyond physicality. The female force exists mostly in Alexei's mother and wife, whereas all the men in the film share one voice and one gaze, the gaze through which we watch the movie. All of the women in the film are united in a single body. The woman is mysterious and neurotic in her silence. The male is analysis and poetry, whereas the female is the object of it. She never explains her actions, she just wears indecipherable facial expressions, and that makes her an object of observation, judgment, and nostalgia by the male gaze. However, the male gaze is returned by the women in the film. It lets us know that while we're seeing the film on screen, we're also being seen. Through their female gaze, the women break the boundary of the screen. In this scene, the image of an old Maria approaching the camera appears to be overlaid atop that of a painting. This illusion is disrupted as her hand extends to wipe the glass screen, and we discern that we've been observing not the real her, but her reflection in the glass. Maria's act of wiping the glass is almost analogous to the instinct of pinching oneself in a dream. It's done to clarify reality, to confirm whether or not one is really in a dream. It's also the act of mistaking a mirror for a window that warrants the wiping of the screen, to see if the woman in the screen is someone else approaching her or herself. In this film, Tarkovsky seeks to render the act of wiping the screen futile, by subverting dreams and reality. In Mirror, the theme of resistance not only lies in his temporal defiance, but it can also be seen as the tension between many spatial elements on the screen, such as the elemental resistance between fire and water. 3 times a fire burns amid water. Whereas the motif of mirrors signifies an interior reflection, windows and doors allows for exterior intrusion, so the dichotomy of inside and outside. They interrupt interiority with exteriority, which is often accompanied by the interruption of darkness with light and vice versa. Spatial resistance also manifests in the form of perpendicularity, which is the resistance of the horizontal by the vertical and vice versa. For example, the horizontal fence that Maria was sitting on at the start of the film is intercepted by her sitting vertically, and then broken when the visiting man sits on it, breaking the boundary that separates space into the outside and the inside. Perpendicularity unfolds across the spatial geometry of Tarkovsky's frame, as vertical and horizontal axes are outlined by trees, window frames, doors, and walls, and of course, mirror frames. The most dominant sense of spatial perpendicularity is established by trees. The verticality of trees standing in a forest mirrors that of the soldiers marching through the horizontal river in the documentary footage. Yet the trees are static and the people are active, just like the mysterious man says,
Деревья, орешник вот этот.
Это ольха.
Да это не важно. Никуда не бегают. Это мы все бегаем, суетимся, все пошлости говорим.
The frequent use of extreme long shots establishes the forest as a grand and still backdrop to movement, and humans as interruptions to its natural continuity. The Russian natural landscape is omnipresent. The pines are immortal and impersonal witnesses to the grand flow of Soviet history, whereas the structure of his childhood home is a solitary interruption to the continuous waves of the forest. It's also a temporal interruption to natural time, because it hosts a distinct temporal zone that's the source of his meandering nostalgia. But when nature prevails over man-made structures, such as when the hayloft is burned down and then later moss takes over the ruins, the internal temporality encapsulated within the structure disintegrates, and nature's own temporal rhythm is restored. The spatial interruption in the film is usually something sparse or solitary against a wide, dominant background. It establishes a contrast between uniformity and individuality, to symbolize individual resistance against dominant oppression. However, these interruptions are often reciprocal. I said that nature is the passive observer, but nature can also be alive as spontaneous disturbances that reverberate through the forest. The mysterious gust of wind that spontaneously blows, and the fire that mysteriously started by itself in the rain. This unpredictable reciprocity between the elements of the film is due to the fluidity of the film. The meaning of the motifs and the relationship between them is unclear and ever-changing. We can't pinpoint which element is the ultimately oppressive one. Ultimately, it adds a spatial dimension to the interrupted temporality of the film to create this ever-present sense of metaphysical interruption, which is both psychological and historical. To end this video, here's a poem that's not quoted in the film but describes the entire film. "And this I dreamt, and this I dream. And sometime this I will dream again. And all will be repeated, all be re-embodied. You will dream everything I have seen in dream. To one side from ourselves, to one side from the world. Wave follows wave to break on the shore. On each wave is a star, a person, a bird. Dreams, reality, death, on wave after wave. No need for a date. I was, I am, and I will be. Life is a wonder of wonders, and to wonder I dedicate myself on my knees like an orphan, alone among mirrors, fenced in by reflections, cities and seas iridescent, intensified. A mother in tears takes a child on her lap. The repetition of time like waves crashing upon the shore. A dream that's prophetic, that connects your future with my past. A dream that's undated yet familiar because time itself is cyclical. An assertion of an eternal individuality. I was, I am, and I will be. Motifs, the multiplicity of nature, and solitary elements, a star, a person, a bird. Mirrors. The screen as a mirror of us, our collective consciousness and our humanity. A mother in tears takes a child on her lap. The indefinite article making the mother-child pair both solitary and universal. The impersonal tone of the last line, a most intimate self-reflection that can only be achieved through self-alienation. Anyway, I'm back after disappearing for 4 months with a video that no one will watch because the full movie on YouTube only has 1 million views. But thank you for 40k subscribers, please don't unsubscribe. I made this video because I remember that someone commented that since I criticize a lot of works, that I should talk about a piece of media that I find to be very coherent. And this is one of them. I know how this looks. Me, self-proclaimed feminist, criticizing strong woman film made by strong women and then praising Russian misogynist dude with mommy issues. I mean, whatever, the point was always that I appreciate resistance when it's not a cash grab. You're probably all sick of the anxious attempts at introspection that I put at the end of my videos, but I haven't posted in a long time. I left for 4 months because the subscriber count was growing and I got scared because it's terrifying to have an online presence. And then when I started making this video, I got anxious that it's not funny and that my audience would be disappointed. When I talk about the theory of anything, like film or feminist or philosophy theory, I thought I had to connect it with material that's in the popular media so that people would watch it, or else what's the point if my target audience is only myself? So then I was split between trying to get my voice out and trying to get my voice to be understood. And then I just left and I didn't upload. So yeah, but I'm really glad to be back and thank you guys for sticking around. I couldn't believe that people were still active in the Discord server while I was gone, but that gave me the courage to come back. And I'll talk about more relevant stuff later on, but I made this video to prove that YouTube isn't my job, so being genuine is more important than views or accessibility or consistency or quality. So I guess the purpose of paying homage to Tarkovsky is a reminder that I'm making videos primarily for myself, and to say exactly whatever I want without distorting it for other people's enjoyment, even though there are consequences to that. But the consequences aren't significant because this is the internet and the internet isn't real. Because this video is so impersonal and I kind of felt like I lost touch with my audience, I might do some sort of Q&A or college update in the future. So feel free to ask questions in the comments that you have about me, and hopefully I'll be posting more actively from now on. But thank you for 40k. I can't believe you're still here. YouTube is the most interesting thing that I've ever done in my life. I could talk for hours upon hours about how grateful I am for this channel and for you guys. And I will do that